Welcome to Grieving Insomniacs. This is your host, Christy Habermann. I'm re-editing some of my first videos. This is the very first one I ever did 2 years ago. It's telling my story and the reason why I started Grieving Insomniacs. If you have any feedback for me, please join my community, and thank you for listening. Welcome to Grieving Insomniacs. I am your host, Christy Habermann. I am glad you're here. Thanks for being a part of our community. A few disclaimers before we get started. I am a licensed therapist. However, this podcast is not to be considered mental health therapy or counseling. It is for entertainment purposes only and is not associated with my counseling practice, Christy Habermann Counseling Services. Thanks for showing up. Welcome to episode 1 of the Grieving Insomniacs. This is your host, Christy Habermann. I have thought of this moment for so long, I'm not even sure where to begin. From the time that my son died in 2011, I knew that it was going to be important to share my story. And you may wonder, why? Why did I have that feeling? I had that feeling because no one would talk about it with me. No one would talk about my son dying. And as a counselor, as a person, as a human being, as someone who seeks connection with other people, I just knew that it was important that I talk about it. And in order to have others talk about it, you have to be vulnerable and you have to be the one to step up to the plate. And so that's what I have decided to do with this podcast is put my story out there to share it with you all so that you know that it's okay to share your own stories. We have to be allowed to talk about it. We have to be allowed to talk about our grief. And so it begins with the story. The story begins with the death of my oldest son, Christopher, in 2011. But that's actually not where the story begins. The story begins a year earlier in 2010. Christopher was living in Louisiana, going to school to be a nurse. He was working and paying his way through school, doing his clinicals. He began posting on Facebook about this rash that had broken out. It was all over his body. And he was posting pictures, talking about how he's taking Benadryl 3 times a day. But he was so busy with school, and also he's a broke college student. It was before Obamacare, so there was no resources for him to go to the doctor. And so he didn't. By the end of the summer, he was starting to show the dark eyes. I was complaining of fatigue, but he just thought it was school. He was like, I'm in my last semester of school. Let me get through this. I can get a job. I'll get health insurance, and then I can pay for it. It seemed like such a simple thing at the time, right? We're just going to put it off. It's only a rash. It's not that big a deal. Thousands of miles away and three states away, I was hopeful too that it was just a rash. Like I didn't even consider for a moment that it was even anything even more serious. I have the mom guilt over that thought. It's like, should I have known that this rash was going to turn into something else different? I've talked about the mom guilt, and we're going to do a whole show just on the mom guilt because it's such a factor when it comes to parents who have lost children, and it's such a part of our grief story. But back to our story. In January of 2011, Christopher began calling home more. Our relationship was maturing from mother to son to grown up, which makes what happened next so much harder. He had turned 24 the May before, and his maturity was improving. You could see it in his behavior. He was going to have a baby. He was so excited to be a father, to create a family. The relationship with for lack of a better term, baby mama didn't work out, but he still wanted to be a father and still wanted to be involved as a father. But he started getting sicker and sicker. He'd call home and say he went to the doctor. First time he went to the doctor, and the doctor told him, "Oh, I think you're just constipated. You need to eat more fiber." He went to the doctor in March. They said, "Oh, you're just tired. You need to take some more iron." It wasn't until April that he went to the doctor again. And this time the doctor must have done a more extensive research because they sent him to the cancer care center that afternoon. And that's how he found out that he had cancer. They didn't know what kind, they didn't know what type, but they knew that he was struggling with something. Numerous tests later, he was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, stage 3B, which is as worse as it gets, on his 25th birthday. He called me that day, and I go into the scene much more detail in my book. But I had gotten the call at work, and after that phone call, he quit talking to me. He would just text. He wouldn't respond to calls. And I would just leave him messages on his phone. I wanted to go take care of him, and he told me no. He said, "You can't. I'll be all right. I want to do it on my own. You can come see me when it's all over." And I believed it. I believed that I would see him when it was all over. But also not talking to him allowed me to be in my own land of denial. I didn't consider the worst case scenario. When you hear cancer, you think, yeah, someone will die. Maybe, but it'll be months down the road. Go through all this chemo, there's a good chance they'll survive. You most certainly don't go through the worst case scenario. At least I didn't. And that day that he told me on the 25th of May, it never occurred to me that death would be the outcome and that the death would come so soon. And I'm sure he was scared too, but that's nothing that he would have shared with me, because my son was a very stoic man. He did not, even as a kid, he didn't share his feelings. He didn't talk. He's not a talker like his mom. And maybe it's because I talk too much. I don't know. There goes that mom guilt again, right? Wondering, well, was it something I said or something I did that made him not want to talk to me? I don't know. I'm telling you, this is why this show is called The Grieving Insomniacs, because I've spent many a night awake at night trying to figure out why he didn't talk to me. And as you can hear in my voice, 10 years later, it's still difficult. It's still difficult to talk about, but it's so important. It is so important, I believe, to put our stories out there, because we need to be able to tell them. We shouldn't have to hide in the dark and deal with it in the dark by ourselves. And so I want you to know I'm here. So let's go back to our story. I feel also guilty for respecting him. Isn't that a crazy thing? But to this day, I still feel guilty because I didn't go right to him and force him to talk to me, force him to tell me what was going on with him, what he was thinking, what he was feeling. Was he afraid of dying? I didn't get to hear any of that. And that's another one of those things that keeps me awake. That's why this show is called The Grieving Insomniacs, because believe me, in the beginning, I wish I would have had something like this, because I just wanted to know if I was normal. And we'll talk about that too. Our fears about not being normal when it comes to our grief, because there's so little information out there. So mom guilt, such a major part of grief. So I want you to know, if you have it, it's normal. We all have it. I've come to accept that it's a normal part of grieving. Anyway, back to Christopher and his cancer. So as I stated before, Christopher got his cancer diagnosis on his 25th birthday, and those are the last words I heard him speak. And it wasn't just me. Christopher never spoke to anyone in our family again before his death. And by his family, I mean my husband, his brother. He talked to my brother. He didn't talk to my aunt. He didn't talk to his grandparents. He didn't talk to anyone. And I don't know if he thought there'd be time afterwards or if he didn't have the words to say, but he just quit talking to us. And so the results were the same. So on June 17th, he went in for his first chemo treatment. And he got the Red Devil. Actually watching a YouTuber called Eamon and Beck. And Beck took the Red Devil as a chemotherapy, and it was so triggering. I'm not going to be able to watch it anymore. So that day he stayed with some friends, and he was feeling really sick. And that evening he decided to go back to his own house. And all weekend, which was also Father's Day weekend, there was no response. It was later that night that I got the call that he had died. And that's as far as we're going to go tonight to talk about, because I'm telling you, it's difficult. It's 10 years later, and as you can hear from my voice, I still get tear up, and I still talk about it. But what's amazing to me is the response that I get from people that hear my story. For those of you who have lost a child, you know well what goes next. Because as you start to say to people, my child died, they get this deer in the headlock look in their eyes. Sometimes they turn white, but I almost guarantee you it's the last time you'll ever speak to them. So losing a child is a very lonely place, and there's this misconception out there that people will surround you in your grief and they will be there for you in your grief. And that was most certainly true, but then people move on to their own lives. And some of them walk away deliberately. They walk away from you emotionally, they walk away from you physically. They just walk away. And so that's why I'm going slow in the telling of my story and adding some of these other things towards the end, because to hear the whole story can be overwhelming to many people. And it's sad. It's sad to hear someone's story. So the first time I realized that I had this gift to be able to hear someone's story is I had someone telling me about an event that had occurred there in their life. And as they were telling me the story, I was right there with them every step of the way. It was almost like I could see the event happening as I was standing right there next to her. And it was just, in some ways, it was just such an awesome experience, because I realized that I had the ability in that moment to do something that other people were not able to do for her, which was to be there for her in that way. And so that's what I'm hoping to do for you as we go through that podcast, is to be there for you in a way that other people cannot be there. Because I have experienced the pain. I have gone into the pain, and I still live with the pain. And I will be there for you in your pain. So most of the time, and I don't know if it's true for the rest of you, and I would love it if you would respond back to me and let me know if this is true for you. But most of the time, I don't get past my son died. It can be someone I knew for 10 years ago. I have friends that I told my son died and they never spoke to me again. This is a common experience. I participated in many support groups after my son died, and numerous times I would see people posting about the fact that they saw someone that mattered to them and they just walked away from them. So the next time you see that person in public, and this happened to me so many times, it happened to me with my own family. I saw them in public and they turn around and they walk the other way, or they reject your calls because you're just too sad. You don't get invited to the holidays anymore. Well, sometimes I was never invited in the first place, but the ones that I were invited to, I don't get invited to anymore. So grief is a really lonely place to be. And you would think more people would have empathy for child loss, but they don't. It's the craziest thing. Or they start talking about that time that their dog died. And it's like, oh yeah, you for real? You're comparing the loss of your dog to the loss of my child? But honestly, I don't know if it's because they want to relate or if it's just safer for them to say that. And I also will say that child loss is one of the least understood of all types of grief. I have seen people show more empathy towards parent loss, towards the loss of a spouse, than they ever have towards the loss of a child. And I'm a mental health therapist. And it was one of the most frustrating things when my son died, because I felt like that I should have the knowledge and the tools, at least from a book, on how to help myself. And it just wasn't there. And so I've gone to several different therapists. All of them didn't have the knowledge to help me. So as I said, I wrote my book, and in many ways, my book was autobiographical, but it was an attempt to understand, but it was also an attempt to understand is how come counselors don't know better? How come? Especially when it comes to the loss of the child. And the fact of the matter is because they're not taught to. The research doesn't exist. Telling you, nobody's done research on us. They don't know how the loss of a child affects you mentally, physically, spiritually, in so many ways. It hasn't been researched. And without research, there's no theories. And when there's no theories, there's no and so if you're going to a therapist and you're struggling with trying to get that therapist to understand your pain, you need to remember that the only way to get help is from someone that has been there. And I truly believe this, that is part of my desire to start this community is that we have to help each other heal. It's imperative that we help each other heal because we're the ones experiencing it. No longer do we want people that have never lost a child to come and tell us how to do it. A relative of mine told me, I'll protect her confidentiality for now, but there'll be a story about it later. But I had a relative tell me that the reason why I was grieving so hard is because I didn't love God enough. God never entered into it because I strongly felt that if God loved me, he wouldn't have taken my child. But she didn't want to have that conversation. She just wanted to tell me what she thought would be better for me. And at that moment, I wasn't strong enough to tell her, you don't get to tell me how to grieve. Today I am. And that's kind of what I'm doing with my podcast, is trying to educate people that have never lost a child. The way that you're treating people that have lost children is harmful. So for those of you that are listening, that are struggling to understand why the world doesn't understand you, it's because understanding only comes from experience. And it's an experience we would not wish on our worst enemies. I have yet to hear somebody say, and all the times of the different people that I work with, to say, I wish this would have happened to so-and-so. I've never heard that. I've heard people say, I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy. So this is why community is so important, and so important for grieving mothers to understand other grieving mothers. Our losses are not the same. My loss is not the same as someone else's loss. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is, through each of our unique losses, there are elements of things that can help each other. So tell me your stories. Tell me what it was like for you. Tell me what you're experiencing, because I am here to listen. This has been a goal of mine for the last 10 years, and I'd be honored to hear your stories, and I'd be honored to walk through with you. Thanks for listening to our stories and being a part of our community. I am your host, Christy Habermann, saying I'm honored that you decided to join our community. For any comments, questions, and concerns, email me at grievinginsomniacs@gmail.com or Grieving Insomniacs on Facebook or Instagram. I also have a book on Amazon.com called The Solitary Journey Through the Loss of a Child. It goes into more detail about my story. Thanks for showing up, and I'll see you next week.